Today I'm going to be presenting to you a paper that I wrote with my dear friend and colleague, Chris Coyne, titled The Samaritan with the Guillotine. So in this paper, we are looking to bridge together kind of two different scholars in their work to talk about some very important issues, not only historically, but contemporarily. More specifically, these have direct implications for things like foreign aid. So when we start, we ask a question. When we think about a liberal or a free society, what does that mean for humanitarianism? What does that mean for humanitarian intervention? Now, if you ask a room full of individuals who identify as being classically liberal or people who are interested in individual liberties and freedom, you will find very different answers about what is a quote-unquote liberal foreign policy, or what is appropriate or inappropriate within the context of foreign aid. But for almost 100 years, even before that, people have been very explicit in the literature that sometimes we can wind up doing bad by trying to do good. And there is a reasonable question of, well, why is that the case? Because typically we think about altruism or other regarding behavior as being very positive. If I want to help someone, I offer them money, I offer them a place to stay, I offer them some kind of help to get them from a less preferred outcome to a more preferred outcome. That should be good, right? Except we know through a variety of different examples, whether we're looking at anecdotes or if we're looking at broader data, that sometimes this doesn't always occur. So the first person that we look to engage with is this lady here, who my guess would be a lot of you might be unfamiliar with because she was unfamiliar to me. This is Isabel Paterson, who in 1948 conceptualized or came up with an idea that she called the humanitarian with the guillotine. So I have this quote down here from her saying, most of the harm of the world is actually done by good people and not by accident, lapse, or omission. It's the result of their deliberate actions, long preserved in, which they hold to be motivated by high ideals toward virtuous ends. So Patterson had two kind of primary concerns when it came to humanitarian intervention and providing humanitarian through the state specifically. And that issue of state-provided humanitarian aid is going to be a big theme today. She suggested that state-led humanitarianism meant the embrace of collectivism. If we are providing humanitarian aid through the state, that necessarily means that we have to have some kind of collective provision of that aid. That collectivism, she suggests, is a threat to individual freedom in the same way that other forms of collectivism are a threat to individual freedom. But more importantly, or I should say in addition to this, she was not just concerned about kind of this encroachment on liberties, but also this threat of tyranny. So thinking about even under the best case scenario, where individuals within the state are motivated by benevolence. They want good outcomes. They're genuine in their motivations. They want things to improve. It requires at least the threat of coercive force. We're going to help, or else. Give us this resource in order to carry out this activity, or we will throw you in jail. Or we will engage in this behavior or that behavior. So she notes that state-led humanitarianism requires the use of coercive force. And this is where we get kind of the name that she ascribes to this, the humanitarian with the guillotine. So you can see there kind of the play that she's using or this contrast of we have people who are here to help, but they're also potentially going to chop your head off. Sounds like a rough go of it. So what we look to do is we look to take the insights from Patterson's 1948 paper, and we bridge with another economist who you might be familiar with. I've had the chance to walk around your campus a few times, the work of economist James Buchanan, who came up with another idea called the Samaritan's dilemma. And I'll talk to you a bit more about what exactly we mean by Samaritan's dilemma coming up here in a little bit. But we look to try to blend these two things together. So the insights that Patterson is bringing with respect to humanitarian aid, the insights that we get from Buchanan with respect to aid or to people offering help altruistically, and then talk about how, even though Patterson was writing in 1948, Buchanan is writing in the 1950s and beyond, how is this still relevant today? Particularly when we go to talk about, again, things like foreign aid. And that foreign aid, by the way, can be in a variety of different capacities. We could be talking about food aid. We could be talking about military aid. There's a lot of different ways that we could apply this. And so what we'll do is we'll go through each of these kind of implications a little bit later after we lay out exactly what we mean by this humanitarian with the guillotine, so a little bit more on what Patterson is talking about, and also talking about what Buchanan means when he talks about this Samaritan's dilemma. So a little bit more on Patterson's humanitarianism. So she recognized, as many people today recognize, that there is real suffering in the world. Now, people might debate me on this, but I think that most people don't like seeing other people suffering. I'm sure there are people out there who genuinely like it, but for the most part, I think we don't like seeing other people in harm's way. We don't like seeing other people in pain or seeing other people struggling, not able to meet their basic needs. So we look at things like poverty, natural disasters, and so on, and there is this real kind of human inclination to try to help. But one of the things that is important for us to recognize, and economists who study things like humanitarian aid ask questions like this: what's possible for us to do? There might be a whole list of things we might really want to do. I'd like to wave a wand and solve the issue of poverty tomorrow. I'd like to wave another wand and solve issues of oppressive governments tomorrow. That's what I'd like to do, but economics is going to tell me what's possible for me to do. Economics might also tell me that some of the policies that I'm interested in implementing, even if they are created with the best of intentions, may not lead to the best outcomes. Now, it's important to understand the context in which Patterson is writing. So I mentioned before that this paper that she publishes, or the work that she's doing, comes out in 1948. So think about what's happening within the broader global context at this point. You are at the very beginning of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. You are looking at the aftermath of the totalitarian governments in Germany and Italy. And within the context of the United States, you're also looking at New Deal policies, where you see a lot more government involvement in a variety of different aspects of life. You have taxation that's been relatively newly introduced. People in the US didn't pay income taxes until the 1940s for the most part. So you see a lot more government intrusion. And she was skeptical of these, particularly this tendency for people to want to rely more on government to fix a variety of different social ills. So here again, we come up with this problem, or this puzzle that she identifies, is what happens when we move from, say, the private provision of aid to this state-led collective aid. It says, if we're going to pursue the common good, someone is going to have to define what that common good is. Now, my guess would be is that if I asked several of you, define for me what the common good is, I would get very different answers. There might be some things that we broadly agree upon, but there's going to be a lot of difference. That difference is not trivial. Because when we start moving from the private to the collective, someone has to be, or some group has to be, the ultimate decider of what is the common good and what is outside of the common good. Moreover, in addition to granting some person or some group decision-making authority about what is going to be pursued, what is good and what is not going to be pursued, or what's not as important, you also have to offer individuals or that group the power to implement those policies. So you have to relinquish decision-making authority and grant people the power to implement the policies they think are correct. Now, my guess would be is you might hear that articulation and automatically, hopefully, see that this might present a problem. But this is not necessarily intuitive. It wasn't intuitive to people at the time that she was writing, and it's not intuitive to a lot of people now. So what Patterson ultimately highlights is this exact dynamic, that when we collectivize aid, we relinquish our freedom and resist, and we open ourselves up to the potential for predation or the potential for those in charge to abuse this authority. This, by the way, is a different type of articulation of something that economists have talked about elsewhere. It's what's referred to as the paradox of power. So the paradox of power is very simply this. In order for government to do anything, whatever things that we might ask government to do, whether that is to pave roads, provide education, provide defense, whatever it is, individuals have to give up some kind of freedom to allow government to engage in those activities. The problem, however, or the paradox, is that by empowering government to do these things, we also empower government to abuse those mechanisms. There's the potential that governments may predate or prey upon the very rights that they are entrusted with protecting. There's a big question there of, well, what can we do to potentially fix that? One potential option is constraints, formal constraints, as well as informal constraints. We'll talk more about those a little bit later. So when Patterson talks about this collective aid, or this humanitarian with the guillotine, she highlights that when, again, we talk about collective aid, that force is a necessary component. Why is it a necessary component? Because you have to have ensured compliance. As I mentioned to you all a few minutes ago, if I ask people here, what's in the common good? I'll give you an example. If I were to take a poll, now this might be a little bit different if I was asking this question in the US. Should the United States be toppling the regime of Iran? Should the US have gone in and removed Nicolas Maduro? I see faces in both directions here, right? What's truly in the common good? That's a question that's up for debate. Now, if I gave the pro-Maduro removal group authority to determine that that was within the common good, how are they going to get the people who are in the let's not remove Maduro group to come along with that policy? Or we could make a similar discussion or have a similar discussion about US policy in Iran. How do we get people to comply when they don't want to? So for example, my income taxes are due in April to the US government. If I said to the US federal government, I'm not cool with what we're doing in Iran and I'm not cool with what we did in Venezuela, I'm not paying you. How do you think that's gonna go over for me? Poorly. It would go over very poorly. So fines and jail. That's coercion. And yet, this is the dynamic that we're talking about. We're doing this again, and a lot of our models actually presume that things like US foreign policy are done in the name of the quote-unquote common good. Then you have to force or threaten to use force against people like me who may not be interested in complying. So what she highlights here is, again, this really important tension that when we talk about, and here I'm referring to foreign aid again, so moving back a bit from military context, but when we talk about humanitarian aid, it's often couched within this idea of very noble rhetoric. We want to help people. We want to eliminate or alleviate poverty. We want children to be safe. We want healthy communities, and so on. But in so doing, there is the potential again for this collective tyranny. So Patterson down here, this kind of last quote that I have on this slide, and then we'll move away from Patterson for a little bit, which she talks about or highlights this perverse or these potential perverse effects of state charity. She says that people's ethics are mistaken. She says the good people give him, referring to the humanitarian, the power he demands because they have accepted his false premise. One aspect of this premise is that the collective has the right to take from others as they see fit in the name of the common good. So on one hand, we have this humanitarian and this potential problem with the collectivization of humanitarianism. But on the other hand, we also have what we call the Samaritan's dilemma. So the Samaritan's dilemma is referring to the biblical parable where you have a man who is struggling on the side of the road. A bunch of these individuals walk by, they pass him over, they don't help him, and then who comes along? This Samaritan. So without going into all of the biblical context, the Samaritan is your outsider. So the point of the story is, in the Bible, is that the outsider helps this person when the people within his own community didn't. Hence the name that Buchanan comes up with the Samaritan's dilemma. So the Samaritan's dilemma is a generalizable framework that talks about a variety of cases where you have aid or help going from a Samaritan, so the person who's offering the aid, to the recipient. So I'll spare you all of the mathematical details because you don't want to see them, and I don't want to really go through all of the gory math details, so we don't need them. But you have these individuals who, at their core, very much want to help. It's like they can't stand to see another person suffering. Do you have one of those friends, or are you one of those people where you see a commercial and they're asking you for money and you're immediately on your phone about to Venmo someone or send them money? We all have one of those friends. I'm that person in our house. I am a bleeding heart every time. They hate seeing suffering. When Buchanan is talking about the Samaritan's dilemma, and again, I'll explain kind of what this is here in a moment, but the context again is important. Just as Patterson was writing from a perspective of pessimism or doubt, so was Buchanan. Buchanan, in his work, both here and a little bit later, talks about this lack of, or this kind of erosion of people's ability to self-govern. So he says people are losing the ability to really do for themselves. And he says or argues that there are a couple of reasons that this is the case. So the first is a question of economics. He says people are now wealthy enough that they can indulge their preferences or their desires to help people. If you are so incredibly poor that you can't feed yourself, you can't feed your own children, you're probably not spending a ton of time worrying about giving what little resources you have to someone, say, 1,000 miles or 500 miles away who's suffering. As you increase in wealth, however, then you start to see things that are happening close to you, further away, maybe really far away from you, and you have the potential to offer help. So one is an economic force, but then the other factor that he suggests that has changed is a change in religious beliefs. So specifically, you have a shift away from it is your individual responsibility to work for and provide yourself, or provide for yourself, this idea of what we call a Protestant work ethic of individual responsibility. You work really hard, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you provide for yourself and your family. So he suggests that these are two factors which have kind of pulled us away from that ability to self-govern. So with this in the background, what's the dilemma? The dilemma is this. The Samaritan genuinely wants to help the people who are suffering. But in doing so, this can create a perverse incentive, or can wind up achieving the opposite outcome of what the Samaritan intends. If you've heard of the phrase of aid dependency is a key manifestation of this Samaritan's dilemma. If I continue to provide aid because I can't bear the idea of seeing someone suffering, individuals may not work to remove themselves from that situation. Why? Because they know they're going to get aid. So what happens here then, or what Buchanan points out, is that this fundamentally changes what a humanitarian transaction was intended to be. So instead of having some short-term aid flow, you wind up with a long-term relationship. And it's strategic in that even though the Samaritan prefers the aid recipient to work hard to try to move themselves out of the least preferred situation to a more preferred situation, the Samaritan is setting up a dynamic where that's actually unlikely, or it's less likely to happen. We can think about this, and we'll talk about this more within the context of contemporary aid. Think about the incentives facing the Samaritan. If you give, say, country Y, if you give country Y $5 million and you say, we want you to improve the literacy rates for children under 18, and they don't. How does it sound if you come back and say, cool, we're not giving you money anymore. Forget those kids. Sound good? No, it sounds terrible, right? Where it's like, yeah, we don't really care about your kids anymore. You had the chance to make them read, you didn't. It sounds awful. And so what happens? You keep pouring more money in. This is, again, a dynamic that we can actually see a lot when we look at various types of aid. Another interesting thing about the Samaritan's dilemma is it actually kind of flips our understanding of who is the power player within the aid recipient, the donor-recipient relationship. Because when we talk about aid, the assumption is what? The individual who controls the money, or who is offering the money, is the one in control. However, if we take what Buchanan is saying about the Samaritan's dilemma seriously, it's not the donor who really is in the position of control, but instead is the recipient who is in our dominant position. Our recipient can actually take advantage of our Samaritan because they know the Samaritan does not want to see them suffer. They know that if they don't do what it is the Samaritan is interested in, the Samaritan's just going to keep donating. So again, it's counterintuitive, but it's something where, if we take it seriously, has profound implications for us when we think about contemporary and historical aid. So we've got these two different people, again, both kind of classically liberal thinkers of varying degrees. So we have Patterson's humanitarian with the guillotine. We have Buchanan's Samaritan's dilemma. So now what I'd like for us to do is to kind of bring these two things together and talk about the Samaritan with the guillotine. Specifically talking more about what this means today and the implications. So with this, I want to run through kind of those 5 key things that we highlighted as being relevant for these dynamics today. So we'll start by talking about the nature of charity. So charity, regardless of how we want to break it down, consists very simply of us transferring wealth from one individual to another individual, or from one group of individuals to another group of individuals. Now, this has an important implication, because for wealth to be transferred, it has to exist in the first place. I can't magically create wealth. We have to do things like work and trade. That wealth has to be created before it can be traded. It has to be created before it can be transferred. I won't read you that second bullet point with this quote from Patterson, though you might be interested in reading it. But this is a really critical insight, and it's going to be more important as we kind of move a little bit further along, is that since the Samaritan is ultimately redistributing resources, we can't replace the Samaritan, or we can't replace entrepreneurs with the Samaritan. But when we look at how people tend to talk about Samaritans versus how people tend to talk about wealth creators or entrepreneurs, we see a really interesting, perhaps puzzling, perhaps troubling dynamic. So you hear about philanthropists, people just giving away money. How do people typically talk about philanthropy? It's great, right? It's wonderful. Here you have this person who's incredibly wealthy and they're giving their wealth away. Contrast that with people who are remarkably wealthy, who maybe are not considered more philanthropists, but are considered more in the realm of entrepreneurs. How do people typically talk about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? Other, political factors and things aside. But here again, this is a really interesting kind of dilemma if we think about it. The person or the people who are working to generate vast amounts of wealth are often villainized, as opposed to people understanding this wealth generation is necessary if we want to achieve a variety of different social goals, including ones that you or I or other people may care about. Now, this question of charity also can lead us to discussions or forces us to kind of have a discussion about where charity comes from. So we've talked about wealth creation versus wealth redistribution, and that creation needs to precede this redistribution. But the source of charity is also important. So here we're bringing Patterson back in again. Think about the difference between private charity, or again, private humanitarian action, versus government-driven humanitarian action. Private charity is voluntary. So it entails voluntary transfers of wealth. If I want to engage in private charity, so I want to give to this charity group or this person, I voluntarily do so. I send them money. What app do you all use to send money? I'm old, so help me out here. You don't? You're just like walking around with gold in your pocket? Like, yep, absolutely. You get out your phone. You use whatever app you use to transfer money. It's a voluntary movement. The private Samaritan does not have legal recourse to employ the guillotine. So if I think that donating to a cause is particularly important, so maybe I want all children upon birth to be gifted a horse. And I think that this is a very, very important thing. Horses are great, kids are great, all kids should have a horse. And I try to convince people to give me money so that I can buy every newborn baby a horse. I can't compel other people to go along with me in that endeavor. People might reasonably say, a horse is a very impractical gift for a newborn. They can't hold their head up, much less ride it. They're also really expensive to keep, right? I don't know about you. I'm not going to keep a horse in our backyard. We have 2 kids. I don't know that I want 1 horse, much less 2. But you could say, nah, I'm not going to give you money for your weird horse humanitarian aid project. That ability to say yes or no is important. So contrast this private scenario where I can opt in and other people can say yes or no to state-provided humanitarian aid, or our state Samaritan. They can compel people to provide charitable funds. Again, relying on a humanitarian justification. So if instead of me standing up here talking to you, someone else in a position of political authority is up here talking to you and says their plan is to give every newborn baby a horse and they're going to tax you for it, you don't really have the ability to say, no, I don't want to provide support for that. In the same way that I don't have the ability to say, I don't want to support this policy or that policy when I go to pay my taxes. This difference, again, is of critical importance. And it highlights a fundamental difference between when we start talking about the state Samaritan and the private Samaritan. To add on to this idea again of force is the state's reliance on force to engage in these types of charitable transfers is important for at least two reasons. So the first reason that it's important is that we have to think about opportunity cost. So I'm going to ask you to participate with me again. How many of you have taken an economics class? Okay, I won't embarrass you by cold calling on people, but hopefully you covered opportunity cost. This probably would have been day 1 or maybe day 2 of class if your professor just decided to do the syllabus on day 1. So remember that opportunity cost is what we give up in order to pursue a particular activity. It's our next best alternative. So if, I'll continue with my off-the-wall example, if the government decides that a humanitarian aid project they want to invest in is gifting every newborn baby a horse, what could we have done with that money instead? What resources could we have, or what things could we have done with those resources instead? Especially because, again, recognizing that these resources are extracted from the private sector. The other thing that is important for us to consider when we talk about this idea of force and the state Samaritan is that when we start moving things from private provision to public provision, we see this change or changes in the scale and scope of government. When we think about things like aid, there's often a tendency, especially now, because for most of you in this room being the age that you are, for myself being the age that I am, a lot of humanitarian aid has historically been provided by governments, by large NGOs, so non-government organizations, and lots of multinational organizations. Now, this might not seem meaningful to you, but take a step back for a moment and think about it like this. Have you ever considered that there are alternative ways of providing aid? Maybe the UN doesn't have to do some of the programs that it does. Maybe this government program doesn't have to operate this way. Maybe this NGO doesn't have to be the primary distributor of this type of aid or that type of aid. When people start to accept more roles for government, this allows government to expand, again, on a couple of important margins. So the two that I have up here are relevant, but I have one that's highlighted. One way that government can change is in terms of scale. So that's just the size of government. So we could think about government spending as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. We could think about number of employees who are employed by local or federal governments. But there are other margins where government can grow too, namely scope margins. Think about scope as the types of activities that government is engaged in. So government is providing this type of program or that type of program. These changes in scale are very difficult for us to measure, but profoundly important if we want to understand how government influences our day-to-day life. So when the state Samaritan becomes normalized, this is likely to perpetuate. And it's likely to be perpetuated by both supply-side factors as well as demand-side factors. So people demand aid. They demand more programs, whether, again, that's at a small kind of local scale or we're talking about international aid programs. People demand more government intervention. What do you think governments do? They intervene. At the same time, there are a variety of dynamics on the supply side or on the state Samaritan side which push us toward expanded growth. So again, other work by Buchanan and other people, again, who I've seen around your campus, so I feel comfortable using these names because they're on walls places. Gordon Tullock is probably a name that you have heard, right? Mansur Olson. I can keep going here. We could be here all day, but I won't. Like literally every person who's on your all's murals, like we could go through. But you have these supply side factors. Bureaucracies tend to want to grow. There are dynamics that push bureaucracies to continue to grow even beyond the initial kind of scope and scale of their activities. So it's multifaceted. Another factor that we want to think about within this context of the Samaritan with the guillotine, or our state's Samaritan, are issues of dependency and also issues of social cost. So mentioned before, kind of the overarching point of the Samaritan's dilemma is this issue of dependency. And while Buchanan, in that initial paper, realized that there could be a significant social cost, he didn't actually discuss how individual dependency compounded up. So saying, hey, for an individual, this might result in dependency, but what does that mean kind of in broader terms or on a larger scale? So here there are a couple of things that we could talk about. One might be that individual reliance on assistance can, again, on the margin, so not saying people are going to go from being productive to completely unproductive, but on the margin, people might move away from engaging in productive activities toward asking for additional resources from our Samaritan. So people may, again, on the margin, work less. They might invest less. If state Samaritans become an increasingly viable way of generating income, then people are going to dedicate resources toward getting portions of that income. Again, this shouldn't sound particularly controversial. If people have an incentive to do something, we'd expect them to do more of it. So if I know that aid flows are going to be a consistent source of revenue, it would make sense personally for me to go after those sources of income. One example of this is people have talked about the US Congress as quote unquote Santa Claus. So you ask him, you write down your wishes as an elected official, you send it to Congress, and then Congress magically delivers this to you. If you know that Congress is going to be a significant or a consistent source of reliable funds, then we have a tendency to go asking him for what we want. Other things to consider are issues related to self-governance. And this, I think, is particularly important. One of the things I love about walking around UFM's campus is your all's poster game is super strong. I have some of them actually hanging in my office. I love them. You all know about self-governance. You also know that it's hard. It's difficult to be kind of the captain of your own ship, to accept responsibility when things go well, but also to accept responsibility when things go poorly. Both Patterson and Buchanan recognize that there is a role for charity in society. But at the same time, they were both very cognizant, at hopefully this point we understand, that there's a thin line between the desire for us to help other people and potentially realizing harmful effects from engaging in that assistance. In particular, there's a real potential threat to this kind of broader point or this broader foundational element of a free society. Buchanan suggested, both here and elsewhere, that it requires, quote unquote, strategic courage for us to maintain a free society. In a later paper, which is the one that I have down here, Buchanan, in a 2005 paper, he talks about people, quote unquote, being afraid to be free. That, again, being your own master is scary. It can be much easier to have someone else tell you what it is that you should be doing. It says people are afraid to take on independent responsibility that necessarily goes with liberty. Demand that the state fill the parental role in their lives. They want to be told what to do and when to do it. They seek order rather than uncertainty. And order comes at an opportunity cost they seem willing to bear. Oftentimes we hear a lot of discussions about things like paternalism, of people saying we're going to, nudge people this direction or the other. If we put the fruit here and the chocolate back here, people are more likely to select the fruit as opposed to the chocolate. But he's not just talking about paternalism, he's talking about parentalism. So in the same way that I tell my 5-year-old, hey, get your shoes on for the 5th time, get your shoes on, we're leaving here in 5 minutes. He says people actually like that. But that's fundamentally at odds with a free society, which requires us to be active and engaged, not only at an individual level, but also within society. So there are just some effects of this, and these effects are really important. He says that the skills and attitudes necessary for a free society may atrophy over time. Why? Because citizens, again, have relieved themselves of that burden of critical thinking and of critical engagement. So just like if you exercise and then you don't exercise for a while and you go back to the gym, or let's say that you're a runner and you used to run 3 miles a day, you take 2 months off, you come back and you're like, I'm gonna run 3 miles today. How does it go? Not great, right? I die if I take that much time off. It's like, I live in Florida, so we have lots of humidity and it's very hot. I'm just crawling the last mile. Not literally, but I want to. Your skills atrophy. It's the same when we talk about, again, kind of the skills of being a free and engaged citizen. The other effect that Buchanan highlights is what he calls churning state dependency. So as people become more integrated into this Samaritan web, as a recipient or as part of these donor organizations, they have a personal vested interest in seeing these dynamics continue and to see these dynamics expand. So he says this has the important implication of weakening opposition to government activities, setting the stage for further increases in government, on both of those dimensions that I mentioned a few minutes ago, so both scale and scope. And as opposed to people questioning these additional activities undertaken by government, they welcome them. So I want to kind of start to finish this up here because I'm getting pretty close to my time. One of the other things that we want to emphasize here, and kind of the 5th point that my co-author and I highlight as to why these dynamics are relevant today, is that Buchanan specifically really emphasized the importance of constraints. The ideology of citizens, that proactive engagement of citizens, is an important constraint, but it's not the only constraint. If you've read or if you know anything about Buchanan's work, you know that he's a big fan of constitutions. He's a big fan of rules and getting rules codified and written down. So he not only suggests codification, but has several just kind of fundamental suggestions. This first one is we have to recognize that the Samaritan's dilemma actually exists. And I know I've spent a lot of time talking about humanitarian aid, and I've mentioned military aid, but there are lots of other contexts in which we can apply this Samaritan's dilemma as well. Again, we think about it most within the context of aid, but it's broadly applicable. We need to recognize the scenarios in which this dynamic has the possibility to exist and what that means. He also suggests that we need to select rules that account for the welfare of recipients and donors, not only in the immediate term, but also in the long term. So taking into account a much broader accounting of what the benefits and costs are of these types of programs, whatever they are. And again, not just the effects on the recipients, but also the effects on the donors. And then the last piece here, which again sounds very simple, but if you know anything about rules, it's actually really difficult to implement in practice, is that rules have to be credible. You have to bind the Samaritan. You have to be able to get the Samaritan to cut off the aid flows if the aid flows aren't working, or if you have these scenarios of dependency. And this is much, much easier said than done. Take, for example, something like food aid. If I'm distributing food aid to a country that's engaged in a civil war, and I find conditions of aid dependency or aid stealing, it may be better off, or we may be better off in the long run if I cut off aid flows. But if I cut off aid flows, it's almost sure that in the short run, people are going to starve to death. That's a really rough trade-off to make. But depending on what the ultimate goal is, that may be a trade-off that we might consider as beneficial in the long term. And again, it sounds so yucky or sounds so awful to say things like that. It's very hard to codify them. So just to conclude very briefly, so again, I'm sure that most of you have heard of Buchanan. Patterson might be someone who is new to you. Both of them noted this importance of individual responsibility, having and maintaining a strong work ethic as being important for a free society. And I know that kind of throughout this, it's been a little bit pessimistic, maybe is the word that I'm looking for, but there is room for optimism. Optimism in the form of looking around at ordinary people who are engaged daily in the principles of a self-governing society. We still have people who are very entrepreneurial, those people who are generating wealth, who are interested in establishing and perpetuating the ideas that not only create and maintain a free society. Human creativity is also a place or a source of optimism. Creativity and innovation is something that not only drives wealth, but also is helpful in other ways. I know I sound absolutely ancient when I say this to you all, but the technologies that you have available to you on a daily basis are nuts compared to what we had, say, 30 years ago. If I wanted to call my friends in the 1990s, I know it's a very long time ago, I had to call their house and talk to their mom or dad when they answered the phone, and then wait for them to hand it to my friend, as opposed to what you all do, which is, I don't know, how old were you when you got your phone? One of you will answer a question for me at some point. 12? Okay. Is that about right? Oh God, okay, 12 sounds very young. But 12. By the time you were 12, picked up your phone, you texted, WhatsApped, called your friend, and your friend picked up the phone. Those types of technologies, totally underappreciated or not necessarily appreciated. So I'll just conclude with this. While Patterson and Buchanan remind us of the potential downsides to helping others, their core message is actually very hopeful, but it's one that requires us to be very intentional and understanding of what it means to be engaged in humanitarian assistance as a free society versus a collective one. So with that, I thank you all very much.